3 days after my surgery, my husband stormed into my hospital room, his face red with rage. "Who paid for it?" he demanded. "Not are you alive? Not did the doctors get the cancer? Just who paid for it?" That was when I finally understood that the $5,200 he refused to give me had never been about money. It had been about making sure I did not survive. And 3 days earlier, I had been sitting in a consultation room at St. Catherine's Medical Center, staring at a printout I could barely read through shaking hands. I was 56 years old, a retired elementary school teacher, and until cancer entered my life, I had been the kind of woman who kept everything in labeled folders, dental records, tax forms, warranty papers. I saved all of it. I believed organization was a form of safety, that if I stayed prepared enough, life might have the decency to warn me before it broke something. Cancer did not warn me. It arrived as a dull pain under my ribs, then fatigue, then a scan, then a biopsy, and finally a kind doctor saying malignant so gently it sounded worse. By that morning, I had finished months of treatment, lost 23 pounds, and resigned from the classroom, where I had taught 3rd grade for nearly 3 decades. I missed the smell of dry erase markers, the crooked handwriting on construction paper, and the way children believed every adult knew exactly what to do. I used to believe that too. Dr. Keller sat across from me with a yellow legal pad resting on one knee. "The mass has changed," he said. "We need to operate now, not next month." "How soon is now?" "Within days." I looked at my sister Ruth, who had driven me to the appointment. She reached across the table and pressed her palm over mine. Dr. Keller continued carefully. "Your insurance has approved the procedure, and most of the hospital charges are covered. Your family has already handled nearly everything outstanding." Nearly everything. Those 2 words landed heavier than the diagnosis. A financial counselor named Melissa came in a few minutes later with a folder. She spoke softly as she explained deductibles, insurance, surgical supplies, and a specialist fee that fell outside the network arrangement. The remaining balance was $5,200, not $52,000, not $500,000, $5,200. It was still far more than I had sitting in my checking account. Treatment had drained my savings in small, relentless bites. Co-pays, prescriptions, rides, groceries, medications that insurance called optional, and my body called necessary. Ruth and my daughter Emma had already helped more than I could bear to accept. I knew Emma had quietly used part of her emergency fund, though she had 2 children and a leaking roof in Ohio. Ruth had delayed replacing her furnace. "I can call the billing office," Melissa said. "But because the surgeon has marked this urgent, they need the balance or a signed financing agreement before admission." My credit was tied up in a house I did not fully control, and accounts I had not been allowed to review for months. That left my husband. His name was Grant Mercer, and to the outside world, he was everything people admired. He was the chief executive of Mercer Dynamics, a logistics technology company headquartered downtown, and business magazines called him disciplined, visionary, and ruthlessly effective. He wore custom suits, donated to hospitals, and knew how to place one hand over his heart when speaking about community. At home, he had become increasingly impatient with illness. At first, he brought flowers. Later, he brought complaints. He hated medical clutter on the kitchen counter. He disliked the smell of broth. He once told me my nausea was setting the tone for the whole house. During the worst weeks of chemotherapy, he began sleeping in the guest suite because my coughing interrupted his rest. Still, I told myself he was afraid. Some men turned fear into anger and discomfort into distance. Marriage, I believed, meant interpreting cruelty generously until the person you loved found his way back. I stepped into the hallway and called him. He answered on the 4th ring. "Claire, I'm in the middle of something." "I know. I'm sorry." The doctor moved the surgery up. There was a pause followed by mumbled voices and the faint clink of glassware. He was not in his office. He was probably in the private dining room at the Carlton Hotel, where Mercer Dynamics held major contract meetings. "What do you need?" he asked. It sounded more impatient than concerned. "They need $5,200 before they can admit me." Another pause. Then, strangely, he laughed under his breath. "Do you have any idea what day this is?" "No, I just signed a $28 million deal." I closed my eyes and leaned against the cold wall. That's wonderful, I said automatically. Congratulations. Exactly. I have executives, attorneys, and clients sitting here, and you call me about another bill. Grant, it's for the surgery. I heard you. The doctor says it can't wait. His voice flattened. I won't give you a dime. I thought I had misunderstood him. Hospital noise moved around me. Cartwheels, intercom announcements, a child crying somewhere behind double doors. What? I said. I'm done paying for your problems. My problems? As though cancer were an expensive hobby I had taken up to annoy him. I lowered my voice. This isn't cosmetic treatment. They need to remove the tumor. You have family? Ask them. They've already helped. Then finance it. I can't qualify without access to our accounts. That sounds like something you should have considered. I did not cry. Not then. Shock can be strangely tidy. It clears the mind and leaves one unbearable fact sitting in the center. My husband could save my life without changing his lunch plans, and he had chosen not to. I have to go. He said, don't call again today. The line went dead. Ruth found me still standing in the hallway with the phone against my ear. She did not ask what he said. My face told her. That afternoon, after Ruth left to pick up clothes from my house, I sat alone in a hospital room. I had not yet been officially admitted to, watching rain slide down the window in thin gray lines. A knock came at the door. The man who stepped inside looked older than the last time I had seen him. Disnorts. His shoulders were narrower, his hair almost completely silver, and there was grease under one thumbnail. Exactly as there had been during most of our marriage. Daniel, my ex-husband, stood there holding a white envelope. He walked to the bed, set it beside my hand, and said very softly, I sold my pickup. Then he turned and left before I could ask him why. For several long minutes after Daniel walked out of my hospital room, I simply stared at the white envelope resting on my blanket. It looked impossibly ordinary. No dramatic flourish, no speech, no expectation that I would open it while he stood there. Just an envelope. My fingers trembled as I lifted the flap. Inside was a cashier's check. $5,200 exactly, not $5,000. Not everything he could spare. Exactly the amount I needed. There was also a folded receipt from a local dealership showing the sale of a 12-year-old Ford F-150. The price wasn't impressive. Neither was the condition of the truck, but I remembered that pickup. I'd ridden in it countless times years ago. It wasn't simply a vehicle. It was Daniel's livelihood. My throat tightened. I looked toward the hallway, but he was already gone. Excuse me. I called weakly to the nurse passing outside. The gentleman who just left. She glanced around. The older man? Yes, he's already gone, honey. I nodded, thank you. She disappeared down the corridor, leaving me alone with memories I hadn't allowed myself to revisit in years. Most people assume that if an ex-husband suddenly sacrifices everything to save his former wife, there must be some unfinished romance. Life isn't that neat. Daniel wasn't the love I had lost. He was the grief I had survived. We met when we were both 123. He repaired farm equipment outside Columbus, Ohio. I had just accepted my first teaching job at Lincoln Elementary. Neither of us had much money. Our honeymoon consisted of 3 nights in a lakeside cabin, borrowed from one of his uncles. The shower barely worked. The mattress squeaked. We thought it was perfect. Our son Michael was born 3 years later. He inherited Daniel's smile and my stubbornness. Every Saturday morning, the 3 of us piled into that same pickup truck. Sometimes we'd drive to farmers markets. Sometimes we'd fish. Sometimes we'd simply buy ice cream and wander through parks while Michael chased squirrels. We weren't rich, not even close, but we laughed more than we worried. At least until the accident. Michael was 16, a rainy October evening. A drunk driver crossed the center line. The police officer who came to our front porch looked younger than our son. Nothing prepares parents for that conversation. Nothing. People imagine grief as crying. Sometimes it is. More often it's silence. Daniel stopped talking. I stopped sleeping. He buried himself in work because engines were easier to fix than broken hearts. I buried myself in my classroom because children still needed multiplication tables, even when my own world had ended. We lived in the same house, but on different planets. Months became years. We rarely argued. That would have required energy. Instead, we slowly disappeared from each other's lives while sharing the same address. One evening, Daniel quietly asked, Do you think we're helping each other anymore? I couldn't answer because I already knew. We signed divorce papers 2 years later. No lawyers fighting, no screaming, no cheating, no betrayal. Just two exhausted people who had survived the worst thing imaginable, but hadn't survived it together. Before leaving the courthouse, Daniel hugged me, not as a husband, as someone saying goodbye to the only witness who truly understood our son's life. I hope someday you smile again, he whispered. I hope you do too. Then we walked in opposite directions, neither of us looked back. Several years later, I met Grant. Everything about him felt stable, confident, successful. He planned vacations 6 months ahead. He balanced investment portfolios for fun. He spoke about retirement as though it were another business acquisition. After years of emotional chaos, his certainty felt comforting. I mistook control for security. Looking back now, I can see dozens of warning signs. He disliked spontaneous affection. He viewed every disagreement as a negotiation someone had to win. Whenever I talked about Michael, he would patiently listen for a minute or two before changing the subject. I convinced myself those things didn't matter. Widows and divorced women in their 40s often hear the same advice. Don't be too picky. Be grateful someone wants to build a future with you. I listened. Sometimes society mistakes settling for maturity. A quiet knock interrupted my thoughts. Dr. Keller stepped into the room. I hear we have good news. I handed him the cashier's check. He looked at it, then looked back at me. I thought financing was still pending, so did I. He smiled gently. We can move forward. The relief washing across his face surprised me. Doctors carry hope professionally, but they also carry disappointment. One less delayed surgery meant one more patient had a fighting chance. Melissa from billing processed the payment before sunset. Every signature felt strangely unreal. Only that morning I had believed I might die because of a number printed on a balance sheet. Now the surgeries was officially scheduled for 6 a.m. the following morning. That night I barely slept, not because I feared the operation. 'Cause I kept wondering why. Why would Daniel sell the one possession that still helped him earn a living? We hadn't shared holidays in over a decade. We exchanged Christmas cards some years. Nothing more. Who told him I was sick? How had he found me? Why hadn't he stayed long enough for me to thank him? The question circled until dawn. The surgery lasted nearly 7 hours. When I finally opened my eyes in recovery, every breath felt like someone dragging sandpaper across my ribs. Machines beeped softly. Someone adjusted my oxygen. Another nurse smiled. Welcome back. My lips barely moved, did they? They removed everything they planned to remove. I closed my eyes again. Not because I was tired, because for the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe there might actually be a future. The next 48 hours passed in fragments. Pain medication, physical therapy, tiny walks down sterile hallways, soup that tasted like warm cardboard, phone calls from Emma and Ruth, flowers from former students. When bouquet arrived anonymously, no card, only white lees. Daniel always remembered that lees had been my mother's favorite flowers. I suspected they were from him. I never found out. Grant never called. Not once, no text, no voicemail, no flowers, nothing. Oddly enough, that hurt less than I expected. His silence simply confirmed what his words had already told me. I won't give you a dime. Those 6 words had ended far more than a conversation. They had ended the illusion of my marriage. On the 3rd morning after surgery, Dr. Keller reviewed the pathology report. His smile appeared before he even spoke. The margins are clean. I stared at him. I'm sorry. We removed the entire tumor. He leaned forward. There will still be recovery, follow-up treatment, and monitoring. But Claire, he paused. The operation was successful. Tears finally came. Not dramatic sobs. Just quiet tears that slid into my hair as months of fear slowly loosened their grip. I was alive. Someone had made that possible by giving up the one thing that made his own life easier. I silently promised myself that if I ever saw Daniel again, I would find the words I hadn't managed 3 days earlier. Thank you. I had no idea that before I got the chance, someone else was already on his way to my hospital room. The knock on my hospital door wasn't gentle. It was sharp, urgent, angry. Before I could even answer, the door swung open. Grant walked in wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first year's teaching salary. His tie was loosened. His jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle twitched near his temple. It snorts. 2 people from the nursing station hurried after him. Sir, visiting hours. I'm her husband. The nurse hesitated. Grant didn't wait. He strode to the side of my bed and looked at me. Not with relief, not with concern, but with the cold calculation I'd slowly come to recognize over the last few years. Who paid for your surgery? For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard him. I had expected many things if he ever showed up. An apology, excuses, even indifference. But not that. What? I asked you a question. His voice echoed through the room. Who paid for it? The nurse stepped forward. Sir, your wife just had major surgery. Please lower your voice. Grant ignored her. I know you didn't have the money. He looked around the room as though searching for evidence. So, who did it? I blinked. Confused. I'm alive. I can see that I had surgery. I know. I nearly died. And there wasn't a trace of emotion on his face. Not relief. Not gratitude, nothing, only frustration. It struck me then that he wasn't upset because I had almost died. He was upset because I hadn't. I don't understand, I whispered. His eyes narrowed. You will. Then, just as suddenly as he'd arrived, he turned toward the door. I'll be back. He walked out before I could stop him. The room fell silent. Even the nurses exchanged uneasy glances. One of them closed the door behind him. I'm so sorry, she said softly. Would you like security notified? I nodded without speaking. Only after she left did I realize my hands were shaking. Not because I was afraid of Grant, because nothing about that conversation made sense. Why would he care who had paid? The surgery was over. The money had already been accepted. Why did it matter now? Later that afternoon, Ruth arrived, carrying fresh clothes and a small paper bag from my favorite bakery. One look at my face and she set everything down. What happened? Grant came. Her expression darkened immediately. What did he want? I repeated every word as accurately as I could remember. She frowned. That's strange, it doesn't make any sense. No. She sat beside my bed. It doesn't. For several minutes, we tried to invent reasonable explanations. Maybe he'd felt guilty. Maybe he wanted to reimburse whoever had helped. Maybe he was embarrassed. Each possibility sounded less believable than the last. Finally, Ruth sighed. Claire, what? I think it's time you spoke with an attorney. I stared at her. A divorce attorney? She nodded slowly. I've been thinking it for months. So have I. Those words surprised even me because they were true. The marriage had ended long before the phone call. The phone call had simply made it impossible to keep pretending. The attorney Ruth recommended was Margaret Lawson. She came to the hospital the following afternoon carrying a slim leather briefcase and a notebook filled with colorful tabs. She looked to be in her early 60s, calm, precise. The kind of woman who never raised her voice because she never needed to. After listening to everything, she asked one question. Has your husband already filed? I don't know. We'll find out. She made 2 phone calls from the hallway. When she returned, her expression had changed. Mrs. Mercer, I could already tell I wasn't going to like what came next. Grant filed for divorce 9 days ago. My stomach dropped. 9 days? She nodded. The petition hasn't been formally served because of your hospitalization. Inical. So, while I was preparing for surgery, he was preparing for divorce. I looked out the window. For some reason, that hurt more than hearing him refuse the money. He hadn't made an emotional decision in a moment of frustration. He had been following a plan, a carefully organized plan. Margaret opened her notebook. There is something else. What? The filing contains language that caught my attention. She slid several printed pages toward me. Most of the legal wording meant nothing. Then she pointed to one paragraph. Read this. My eyes slowly moved across the page. Petitioner asserts respondent's deteriorating medical condition substantially limits her future earning capacity, ability to maintain independent living, and long-term life expectancy. The words blurred. I looked up. What does that mean? Margaret answered carefully. It means your illness was incorporated into his legal strategy. My cancer? Yes, I couldn't breathe. He expected me to die. She chose her next sentence very carefully. I can't speak to what he expected emotionally. She paused. But legally, he anticipated that your medical condition would significantly affect the financial outcome of the divorce. The room became impossibly quiet. Margaret continued. If someone is believed unlikely to recover or incapable of living independently, Settlement negotiations often change. I felt cold despite the warm afternoon sun. So, he had every reason to believe the surgery wouldn't happen, or that I wouldn't survive it. Margaret didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence did it for her. Suddenly, Grant's question echoed inside my head. Who paid for your surgery? Not because he cared, because someone had disrupted his plan. Someone had changed the outcome. Someone had saved me that night. I barely slept. I replayed the phone call over and over. I won't give you a dime. I'm done paying for your problems. At the time, those words had sounded cruel. Now, they sounded calculated. $200. Such a tiny amount compared to $28 million. He hadn't refused because he couldn't afford it. He had refused because paying it might allow the surgery to happen. The realization made me physically ill. The next morning, while a nurse checked my incision, I casually asked, "Has anyone called asking about me?" She smiled. "Oh, what? There has been someone." "Grant," she shook her head. "No, my daughter, not her," I frowned. "Who?" The nurse glanced down at her clipboard. "I probably shouldn't share personal information. It's okay," she smiled. "Every morning since your operation, an older gentleman has called." My heartbeat quickened. "He never asks to speak with you. What does he ask?" "Just one thing." She smiled again. "Is Claire getting stronger today?" My eyes filled before she even said his name. "He never tells us much about himself." She paused. "But yesterday, one of the nurses recognized him when he stopped by the lobby." "Who was it?" She looked directly at me. "Your ex-husband." I turned my face toward the window before the tears escaped. Daniel hadn't wanted credit. He hadn't wanted gratitude. He hadn't even wanted me to know he was checking on me. Every morning, he simply wanted to know whether I was still alive. And for the first time since Grant had burst into my room, I realized something far more important than the divorce papers. The man who had once promised to love me forever had quietly planned a future without me. The man who had once let me go had been praying every day that I would live. The morning after I learned Daniel had been calling the hospital every day, I felt something inside me shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to realize I had spent years explaining away behavior that should never have needed an explanation. For too long, I had mistaken neglect for stress, cruelty for exhaustion, control for responsibility. Margaret Lawson arrived just after 10, carrying a thicker file than the one she'd brought the day before. "I've started requesting financial disclosures," she said, settling into the chair beside my bed. "Do you expect Grant to cooperate?" She gave me a faint smile. "I expect his attorneys to cooperate only as much as the law requires. And Grant. I expect him to make this difficult." That answer didn't surprise me. What surprised me was everything that came next. Margaret opened a folder filled with corporate records, public filings, and property documents. "I've spent 30 years handling divorces involving business owners," she said. "Most people assume the difficult part is proving infidelity." She shook her head. "It rarely is. The difficult part is following the money." I listened quietly. "Grant owns Mercer Dynamics, but that's only part of the picture." She slid the first document across the bed. "Darif. Over the past 18 months, substantial sums have been transferred from accounts associated with his executive compensation into another limited liability company." "I've never heard of it." "I didn't expect you had." The company had a bland name, Northridge Consulting. No website, no employees listed. Just a mailing address in Delaware. "What is it?" Margaret looked directly at me. "Possibly nothing." Then she paused. "Possibly somewhere to hide assets." My stomach tightened. "Is that legal?" "Sometimes. And sometimes. It depends why the transfers were made." She placed another document on top. The amounts made my head spin. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, then millions. Money moving from one entity to another, with descriptions vague enough to satisfy accountants, but reveal almost nothing to ordinary people. I had shared a home with this man. I hadn't even known these accounts existed. 2 days later, Margaret returned with another discovery. "This one," she said quietly, "is harder to explain." She handed me property records, a luxury condominium overlooking the river. Purchased 11 months earlier, cash, no mortgage. The owner listed wasn't Grant. It was Northridge Consulting. "The same company?" She nodded. I stared at photographs of a sleek glass building with rooftop gardens and panoramic views. "I've never been there." "I know. So why buy it? Margaret folded her hands. Because someone has been living there. I looked up. Who? She answered with careful professionalism. A woman named Vanessa Cole. The name meant nothing. Who is she officially? Margaret checked her notes. She's listed as a marketing consultant for Mercer Dynamics. And unofficially, Margaret didn't need to answer. The silence was enough. I closed my eyes. Oddly, I didn't feel jealous. That emotion belonged to marriage is still worth saving. Instead, I felt embarrassed. Embarrassed that I'd ignored all the late meetings, the weekend conferences, the overnight business trips that somehow required expensive dinners, but never included spouses. I remembered asking once if I could join him at a charity gala. He'd smiled politely. It isn't really your scene now. I understood. It had never been about the event. It had been about who would already be there. A week into my recovery, Margaret brought something that hurt even more. Insurance documents. You should look at these. I frowned. I thought our insurance covered most of my treatment. It did. She pointed toward a cancellation notice. Your supplemental cancer policy didn't. I read the date twice, then a third time. Cancelled. 5 months earlier. Effective immediately. Policyholder authorization. Grant Mercer. I stared in disbelief. I never agreed to this. You didn't need to. Why? The policy listed him as the primary administrator. I struggled to breathe evenly. You're telling me? He canceled additional coverage months before your surgery. I remembered countless conversations when bills had started arriving. Grant had always acted surprised. Insurance costs are impossible. Healthcare costs are outrageous. We'll figure something out. All the while, he already knew the coverage no longer existed because he had canceled it himself. The missing $5,200 suddenly made horrifying sense. Without that cancellation, there probably wouldn't have been any balance due at all. Every discovery forced me to re-evaluate another memory. I remembered birthdays he'd forgotten, anniversaries interrupted by business calls, medical appointments he suddenly couldn't attend. None of those things had destroyed our marriage individually. Neat together, they painted a picture I had refused to see. Grant hadn't slowly fallen out of love. He had slowly withdrawn every obligation while preserving every public appearance. To everyone else, we remained the perfect couple. At fundraising dinners, he held my hand. During interviews, he praised my years as an educator. Corporate newsletters regularly featured photographs of us smiling beside oversized donation checks. People constantly told me how lucky I was. You two make such a wonderful team. I used to smile politely. Now those photographs made me feel sick. 3 days later, Margaret called with unusual urgency. I need you to watch tonight's local business awards. I don't usually watch television. You should tonight. Ruth helped me stream the event from my hospital room. Grant looked immaculate in a tailored tuxedo, confident, relaxed, as though nothing in his life had changed. The host introduced him as one of the state's most generous corporate leaders. Applause filled the ballroom. Grant accepted an award for community leadership. Then he stepped to the podium. I believe success carries responsibility. More applause. Our company has always believed in giving back. Another smile. This year, Mercer Dynamics is pledged $3 million to expand cancer research and patient support. The audience stood. People cheered. Some even wiped away tears. I sat frozen in my hospital bed. $3 million. Just 1 week earlier. I won't give you a dime. The room blurred through tears I refused to let fall. It wasn't the money. It had never been the money. It was the unbearable hypocrisy. He could promise millions beneath crystal chandeliers while refusing $5,200 that would save the woman he had vowed to love. Ruth muted the television. I don't know how he sleeps. Neither did I. Margaret called 15 minutes later. You watched. Yes, there will be video. I know there will be witnesses. I know, and eventually, she paused. There will be questions. The following morning, another piece of the puzzle quietly fell into place. Margaret received preliminary financial disclosures from Grant's legal team. Most were routine. One wasn't. A memo between attorneys referenced projected post-divorce financial obligations. The language was dry, clinical, almost mechanical. But one sentence lingered in my mind long after Margaret finished reading it aloud. Anticipated reduction in future spousal support exposure based upon respondents' declining medical prognosis. Projected anticipated reduction. Someone had calculated my future using spreadsheets. Not as a wife, not as a person, as a liability expected to disappear. I felt strangely calm, not because it hurt less, because the truth had finally become impossible to deny. Grant hadn't become heartless overnight. He had simply become better at hiding it. And like every carefully constructed lie, his was beginning to crack under its own weight. By the time I was discharged from the hospital, I had stopped asking one question. Why? Why Grant had become the man he was no longer mattered. Whether greed had changed him, whether success had hollowed him out, whether he'd always been capable of this, I would probably never know. Another question had taken its place. Now, what happens when the truth no longer stays hidden? I wasn't interested in revenge the way movies portrayed it. I didn't want to slash tires. I didn't want to scream outside his office. I didn't want to embarrass myself trying to embarrass him. I simply wanted the truth to exist where everyone could see it. As Margaret often reminded me, you don't have to push the first domino. Sometimes all you have to do is stop holding it up. That turned out to be exactly what happened. The first crack appeared inside Mercer Dynamics itself. Not because of me, not because of Daniel, because of an accountant named Kevin Brooks. Margaret couldn't tell me everything, while the investigation was still confidential, but she explained enough for me to understand. Kevin had spent nearly 15 years in the company's finance department. He wasn't looking for fraud. He was preparing documents for the annual audit when he noticed something odd. Several executive compensation transfers had been routed through Northridge Consulting and then redirected again, only days later. The amounts weren't small. Neither were the timing patterns. When he compared them with board-approved compensation reports, the numbers didn't line up. At first, he assumed someone had made a clerical mistake. Then he found another discrepancy, then another. He quietly reported his concerns to the company's internal compliance officer. Corporate Al-Chatali required that they investigate. No one outside the company knew yet. But the first domino had tipped. The second fell only a week later. Mercer Dynamics held its quarterly board meeting. Normally, those meetings lasted a few hours. This one stretched well into the evening. Margaret had contacts who occasionally handled corporate governance matters. And although she couldn't share confidential discussions, she did tell me something important afterward. The board has started asking questions. What kind? The expensive kind? She smiled faintly. When directors begin requesting original financial records instead of summaries, executives usually stop sleeping. Well, what happens now? They verify everything, and if something doesn't match, they keep digging. Grant had spent years building a reputation as a disciplined leader. Now that same reputation worked against him. People assumed his records would be immaculate. Any inconsistency stood out even more. Meanwhile, my divorce case moved forward. Margaret requested complete financial disclosures. Grant's legal team delayed. Margaret filed motions. The judge ordered compliance. More records arrived. Some answered questions. Others created entirely new ones. One afternoon, Margaret spread dozens of documents across her conference table. I was finally strong enough to visit her office in person. Sunlight streamed through the windows while she organized everything into neat stacks. There, she said, pointing toward one column. Those are the disclosed assets, Nye. She pointed toward another. And these transactions we believe weren't properly disclosed. The second stack was noticeably thicker. I looked at her. Is this unusual? She didn't hesitate. Very. She tapped a property record, the condominium, another document, consulting transfers, another executive bonuses. Then she looked directly at me. The more they explain, the more inconsistencies appear. Around the same time, someone outside the company began asking questions too. Not a reporter, not yet. A donor. Mercer Dynamics had publicly celebrated Grant's $3 million pledge to the Regional Cancer Foundation. The announcement attracted attention from local philanthropists. One of them happened to know someone who volunteered at St. Catherine's Medical Center. Conversations overlapped. Names surfaced. Someone quietly remarked how strange it was that a man publicly donating millions had reportedly refused to help his own wife pay for life-saving surgery. Nobody knew every detail. But curiosity spreads remarkably fast among people accustomed to writing large charitable checks. Questions turned into phone calls. Phone calls became whispers. Whispers eventually reached a business columnist who covered corporate leadership and nonprofit fundraising. The article appeared on a Thursday morning. It wasn't sensational. It didn't accuse Grant of crimes. It simply asked uncomfortable questions. How should the public evaluate corporate philanthropy when private conduct appears dramatically inconsistent? The columnist carefully avoided speculation. Instead, she listed confirmed facts. Grant Mercer had pledged $3 million to cancer-related charities. His wife had recently undergone emergency cancer surgery. Reese court records confirmed divorce proceedings. Public filings showed pending financial disputes. The article ended with one sentence that lingered in readers' minds. Generosity presented before cameras inevitably invites scrutiny when compassion appears absent behind closed doors. By lunchtime, the story had spread across social media. Former employees commented anonymously. Some defended Grant, others remained silent. Silence often says more than words. Investors noticed. Public companies survive on confidence almost as much as profits. Analysts began asking whether the financial transfers connected to Northridge Consulting had legitimate business purposes. The board responded by announcing an independent review. The stock price dipped not dramatically, just enough for financial news outlets to notice. Grant released a carefully worded statement. He denied wrongdoing. He insisted the transfers reflected standard executive planning. He described his divorce as a deeply personal matter. Ordinarily, that might have ended the story. Instead, every statement encouraged another question. Vanessa Cole disappeared almost overnight. Her consulting contract quietly ended. The luxury condominium was suddenly listed for sale. Margaret called me after noticing updated property records. It appears she's moved out. I wasn't surprised. Relationships built on secrecy often dissolve the moment sunlight reaches them. Grant, however, appeared increasingly desperate. Several times he attempted to contact me. I didn't answer. Then he left voicemail after voicemail. Not apologies, requests, demands. Call me. We need to discuss this. You have no idea what's happening. For the first time since our marriage began, I realized he wasn't controlling the situation anymore. Events were controlling him. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel called me. Not the hospital. Me. I'd finally insisted the nurses give him my number after learning he'd been checking on me every day. His voice sounded exactly as I remembered. Steady, gentle. You sound stronger. I am. I'm glad. We talked about physical therapy, my grandchildren, the weather, anything except the truck. Anything except the money. Near the end of the conversation, he quietly asked, "Has Grant been bothering you?" A little. A long silence followed. Then he sighed. He came to see me. I sat upright despite the soreness in my side. What? Yesterday? My heart pounded. Why? He wanted to buy my silence. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He offered money? Daniel chuckled softly. He offered quite a lot. What did he want you to stay quiet about? He didn't say directly. What did you tell him? Another brief silence. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice remained as calm as ever. I told him something my father used to say. What was that? I don't sell my conscience. The line was quiet. I closed my eyes. Years earlier, grief had ended our marriage, but it had never taken Daniel's integrity. Some things survive even the deepest heartbreak. A week later, Margaret called with news that surprised even her. The board has placed Grant on administrative leave, pending completion of the internal investigation. I leaned back in my chair. He lost control of the company temporarily in the divorce. It continues. What happens now? Margaret smiled. Now. She closed the file in front of her. The dominoes keep falling. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for disaster. I was simply waiting for the truth to finish what it had already begun. By the time my divorce case finally reached the courtroom, nearly 8 months had passed since the day Daniel quietly placed that white envelope on my hospital bed. 8 months of physical therapy. 8 months of follow-up scans. 8 months of learning how to trust tomorrow again. The scar across my abdomen had faded from angry red to a thin silver line. Some mornings it still locked. But unlike before, the pain reminded me that I had survived. The courtroom itself was surprisingly ordinary. No dramatic speeches. No shouting, no surprise witnesses bursting through the doors. Real life is quieter than television. Justice usually arrives one document at a time. Judge Eleanor Watkins had spent decades on the family court bench. She listened far more than she spoke. When she did speak, everyone else stopped. Grant sat across the room with a different attorney than the one who had filed the original petition. Margaret quietly explained that his previous legal team had withdrawn several months earlier. Too many conflicts, too many unanswered questions. Grant looked older than I remembered. Not because of gray hair, because certainty had disappeared from his face. The confidence that once filled every room had been replaced by exhaustion. The corporate investigation had changed everything. Mercer Dynamics' independent auditors had uncovered years of undisclosed financial transfers through Northridge Consulting. The board concluded that Grant had repeatedly failed to disclose material financial arrangements, misrepresented executive compensation, and violated fiduciary obligations owed to both the company and its shareholders. The affair itself wasn't what ended his career. Companies survive scandals, markets forgive personal failures, but boards rarely forgive executives who deceive them. 3 weeks before our final divorce hearing, the board voted to terminate Grant as chief executive officer. His resignation was announced publicly the next morning. The headlines focused on governance failures, undisclosed transactions, and loss of shareholder confidence. His personal life became little more than a footnote. Ironically, that probably hurt him even more. He had always cared most about his reputation as a businessman. Now that reputation was gone. During the hearing, Margaret calmly presented evidence showing assets that had never been properly disclosed during our marriage. Property records, financial transfers, insurance cancellations, corporate documents. Each exhibit told only a small part of the story. Together, they revealed a pattern impossible to dismiss as oversight. Grant testified briefly. He insisted every financial decision had legitimate business purposes. He claimed the supplemental insurance policy had been canceled as part of a routine review. He denied intentionally placing me at financial risk. The judge listened patiently. Then she asked one simple question. If your wife required only $5,200 to proceed with medically necessary cancer surgery, why did you refuse? For the first time since I had known him, Grant had no immediate answer. Silence filled the courtroom. Finally, he said quietly, I didn't think. His sentence never finished because there was nothing left to say. Judge Watkins' written decision arrived 2 weeks later. The marriage was dissolved. Because of Grant's failure to disclose significant marital assets, the court awarded me a substantially larger share of the marital estate than he had originally anticipated. Margaret called it an equitable correction. I called it accountability. No amount of money erased what had happened, but the law had refused to reward dishonesty. That mattered. Life slowly became ordinary again. And I discovered that ordinary is a gift. I learned to grocery shop without checking the oncology calendar first. I planted tomatoes behind my small townhouse. I attended my granddaughter Lily's school play and cried far more than the performance probably deserved. I even began volunteering one afternoon each week at the elementary school where I had once taught. Children have a remarkable ability to remind adults that hope is not complicated. One little boy handed me a crayon drawing after I helped him sound out difficult words. The picture showed 2 stick figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. He had written in wonderfully imperfect spelling, "Thank you for helping me." I placed it on my refrigerator. It remains one of my most valuable possessions. There was one promise I still needed to keep. Daniel never mentioned the truck again, not once. After my recovery, we occasionally met for coffee. Sometimes we talked about Michael. Sometimes we sat quietly watching people pass by. Our friendship returned naturally, without pressure or expectation. Neither of us tried to rewrite history. We simply accepted that grief had once separated us, while kindness had unexpectedly brought us back into each other's lives. One afternoon, I asked where he was working. I've been borrowing my nephew's truck when I can, and when you can't, I make do. He smiled as though it weren't important, but I knew better. That old pickup had been more than transportation. It had been his independence, his work, his dignity. Over the next several months, I quietly set aside part of the settlement money, not because I felt indebted, because gratitude deserves action. Margaret helped me locate a dealership that specialized in reliable used work trucks. After weeks of searching, we found one. It wasn't luxurious. It didn't need to be. A late-model Ford F-150 with low mileage, a clean maintenance history, and enough towing capacity for everything Daniel needed. On a warm September afternoon, I asked him to meet me outside the dealership. He arrived expecting lunch. Instead, I handed him a small envelope. Inside was a key. He looked confused. "What is this?" I pointed toward the blue pickup parked near the entrance. "It's yours." He stared at the truck, then at me. "No." "Yes, Claire, I can't. You can?" He slowly shook his head. "I didn't help you so you'd buy me something." "I know." "Then why?" I smiled through tears. "Because the day you sold your pickup, you gave me the chance to keep living." I took one step closer. Today, let me help you get your road back." For several seconds, he simply stood there. Then he wrapped his arms around me. Not like a husband, not like a man asking for another chance. Just like someone sharing a moment too meaningful for words. People sometimes ask whether Daniel and I ever remarried. The answer is no. Life isn't obligated to return to where it began. We didn't need another wedding. We didn't need promises we had already learned to honor in different ways. We became something quieter, two old friends connected forever by the memory of a son they lost, a life that was saved, and a kindness neither of us would ever forget. Sometimes love doesn't return wearing the same name. Sometimes it returns as respect. Sometimes as forgiveness. Sometimes simply as someone who answers the phone when life falls apart. Nearly a year after my surgery, I attended the opening of a patient assistance fund at St. Catherine's Medical Center. I asked that my name remain absent from every press release. No ribbon cutting, no speeches, no photographs. Just one small plaque mounted near the financial counseling office. Every patient waiting outside could read it. No one should lose a life over a few thousand. Whenever I visit the hospital for follow-up appointments, I stop there for a moment. Sometimes I see frightened families reading those words. Sometimes I notice relief on someone's face after learning help is available. Each time I think about two men, one had more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. The other had only an old pickup truck, nutty. The wealthy man believed generosity was something performed beneath bright lights, in front of cameras and applause. The other believed compassion was something you did quietly, even when no one would ever know. One lost his fortune, his position, and the respect he valued most, not because he was unfaithful, but because he built his life on deception and selfish choices that eventually demanded their price. The other lost a truck and gained something money could never purchase. My lifelong gratitude. If my journey taught me anything, it is this. Money can buy comfort, it can buy influence, it can even buy applause, but it cannot buy character. Character is revealed when another human being is at their most helpless. A single act of kindness can change more than one life. Cruelty always carries a cost, even if the bill arrives much later. And the richest person in any room is never the one with the largest bank account. It's the one who still reaches out of hand when someone else has nothing left to hold on to. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of someone, or made you reflect on the kind of person you hope to be when someone needs you most, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about resilience, justice, forgiveness, and the quiet power of kindness, please consider subscribing so we can share another journey together soon.